Okay, we have reached 2 o'clock, so I think we're going to make a start. I'm just going to make some introductions before I hand over to Neil. Good afternoon all. I am Amy from the Vevox education team, and thank you very much for joining our webinar today. I'm very pleased to introduce our guest speaker, Neil Pickles, from the University of Wrexham Glyndŵr, and I actually meant to double check that I pronounced that correctly. I hope I did. Neil is actually quite an active user of Vevox and has been for a number of years. He's also done a webinar with us before in the past on quite a different subject to what he's doing today. He's not really talking about how he's using it in class specifically, but more about how best to pose your questions to students to get the most out of them. Let me move my slides on slowly. Okay, so before we get started, I just wanted to introduce you again, if you didn't hear earlier, the software that we'll be using today is obviously Vevox, and we'll be using it for Q&A during the session. Neil will be answering any questions that we have at the end of the session. So to join the Vevox app, please go to vevox.app or download our native app. Once you get to the join screen, please enter the 9-digit code. The code is shown on screen, and the code for today's session is 139643-259. The code will be displayed on all of Neil's slides, so you will be able to find that code there later if you're not able to join right now. So thank you very much. That's it from me for now. I'll be back at the end of the webinar to ask Neil some questions, but what I'm going to do now is hand over to Neil to get on with the presentation today.
Okay, thank you, Amy. So I'm going to make a start now, and good afternoon to everybody. And the idea of this webinar is to talk about what questions do you have, and the title for this is quite deliberate really, in terms of talking about different strategies that you might have for asking questions and also to promote questions from students. But I think it's worth to say that some of these reflections may have benefits outside of academia and with students, so may have some benefits in business and in other areas. So in terms of what I would like to talk about, is firstly about student confidence as a concept and about creating the right atmosphere, which is often the most important part to allow for an engaged audience. The purpose and strategy, quite simply, it's important to have a purpose and have a strategy, and approaches and phrases to avoid. So when I talk about the reflections in here, I have to say that most of it is based on mistakes that I've made in the past. So rather than making your own mistakes, learn from my mistakes. I should say that this is very much based on anecdotal evidence from my own experience. However, I will reference a few areas of pedagogy, but not too much. And also looking at other strategies, thinking on your feet what to do when things aren't quite going right. So what do we mean when we talk about student confidence? Well, one of the problems when you've got a group of students in front of you is that you might talk too much. And what we want is the people in the audience to be able to respond. So you have to bear in mind how much you are talking. Right now, I'm doing all the talking. Is there room for someone else to interject and to say things? Another common problem is that you might have questions that you want to ask students or a group of people, and you ask them to prepare beforehand. They don't prepare, and therefore you struggle to get a response from them. Again, it has to be built into your strategy of what to do if that does happen. One that often comes up is about quiet and dominating students. What do we do with students who are very quiet and we want to get more out of them? What do we do if we get someone who's dominating the discussion? That might be something that we pick up on later on. One of the things that does come out sometimes in some analysis is that students often want answers rather than providing answers themselves, and students don't always want discussion. This isn't true in all circumstances, but it is worth pointing out that it is a risk. You can see a reference here. This is about teaching small groups, but these comments come from this particular paper. And another point to make is that it really does depend sometimes on the number of people in your audience in terms of how you approach your question and answer strategy. So one of the things I've done in my practice is get student feedback about how they feel about questions and answers. And one of the important points is that students often like performing tasks. You give them things to do, but they're less keen on providing answers, particularly if those answers are to be delivered out loud. Linked to that is that the majority of students are less positive about verbal communication. But this is true with any audience. No matter how experienced the audience is, everybody has experienced that moment when you talk and you ask a question and there's silence. But we're going to talk about that more. But these are some quotes from students in the past. In terms of being given tasks, they were positive about being given tasks because rather than being spoken to and drifting off, they had to think for themselves. But many students didn't feel confident about providing an answer. And again, within a small group, often students feel more on show. And so they felt nervous about answering because when you answer in a small group, you're readily identifiable, which isn't the case when you're in a very large group. So again, when you're thinking about how to encourage people to answer and ask questions, you have to think about the environment, how many people are in the room. However, some students prefer a small group because talking in a large group requires often more volume if you don't have a microphone. So again, this has to be factored in. And again, going back to a small group, often students can feel that there's nowhere to hide. If you like, we always want our audience and our students to contribute, but we have to remember that if we want to get the most out of them, we don't want to feel as if they need to hide away. And the following points are really not my comments, but comments from a piece of literature, but it's worth just expressing these as some formal statements before we move on. And so you can see the first one there is that analysis has shown that students struggle to formulate and express coherent arguments. That doesn't mean that they don't have coherent arguments. The key thing is formulating and expressing it, particularly in a verbal way. And so when we ask for students to engage with us in dialogue, they often demonstrate a low level of engagement. And so one thing that is often overlooked is that both teachers and students need to be given explicit teaching in the skills associated with development of arguments, and also the characteristics associated with effective group discussions. And that is a key point. In terms of allowing an effective group discussion, allowing effective dialogue. So the slides coming up is really some of my reflections in terms of how you can give the presenter and the audience those skills to have effective dialogue. So the first is creating the right atmosphere. And this is one of these slides where it's common sense. But the problem with common sense that it isn't always very common. And so I'll list these in one go, and none of this will be surprising to you, but body language has a big effect. If we use open body language, that can be really effective for getting people to answer questions. Often the temptation is to fold our arms, but that can seem quite a defensive mode. So you have to think about your body language. The environment itself, if we want people to be able to ask questions, then you need a good acoustic environment. You need an environment where people can talk without having to raise their volume too much. So we have to bear that in mind. Positioning as well. And this is one of those areas where it's easy to make a mistake. You're standing right by someone and then you ask out loud what they think. Immediately that they feel that they are on show and under pressure. So you have to think about how you're positioning yourself when you're asking questions. And probably most important is tone. If we want people to talk, it shouldn't feel like an interrogation. And so the way in which we ask questions is really, really important. And linked to that is the wording. And that's really what I'm trying to talk to you about today, is to think about the wording. I don't have all of the answers or all of the questions that you might want to improve how to have dialogue, but it is important to just stop and think, how am I asking my questions? Why am I asking those in that way? So moving on, as well as creating a good environment, you need to have a clear purpose for your questions, rather than just asking a question for the sake of it. Why are we asking questions? Is it that we always want an answer? Most of the time, yes. The reason for asking a question is because we want an answer, but that isn't always the case. Sometimes it's perfectly valid to ask a question to allow your audience to think, particularly for a group of students. We don't necessarily want an answer straight away. We want them to go away and have a think about it. It can be used to stimulate debate. So some questions can be deliberate in a way that stimulates debate rather than a yes or no answer. From an education point of view, questions are often seen as really useful to check recall and to check knowledge. And that can be a really powerful use of questions, but bear in mind the pressure of asking and answering questions in a live setting doesn't necessarily translate into an accurate picture of the recall of facts from a group of students. One good purpose, which I came to in the first bullet point, is encouraging further study. If we can encourage further study, then that's part of the battle as educators. And takeaway questions, again linked to the first bullet point about do we want an answer. Takeaway questions are really useful in terms of a question that your audience has to take away and have a think about and reflect on. So once we have a purpose for asking our questions, whether we want an answer, whether we want debate and so on, we need to think about our strategy for how and why we're asking questions. So one of the first ones is how students can provide answers or questions. So in many settings, verbal question and answer is perfectly valid. But for example, we're using something like Vevox, that's a different method to provide answers or questions in terms of the mechanisms, whether it's via an app or via a web link and so on. And there's a number of ways to do this. And there are benefits to that approach, but it doesn't mean that you would necessarily want to use something like this app for all questions and answers. You have to be clear about why you're trying to do what you're doing. Be clear on the purpose, that has to link to your strategy, and know the desired outcome. Is it that you're looking for a particular answer? Is it that you want to scope the range of answers in the room? Is it that you want to stimulate debate? This links to the purpose. So you need to know what your desired outcome is. For some people, it might be that you just want to check that somebody in the room knows an answer to a question. This is a really important one. Be prepared for silence, particularly in an educational environment. One of the most dreaded things is when you ask a question and you are faced with complete silence. However, one thing I've learned is that silence isn't always a negative. If it means that people are really thinking more deeply about a question or are thinking about questions they want to ask, silence isn't always a bad thing. And there's a temptation to always fill a silence, but sometimes I encourage you just to give your audience a little bit longer to have a think about the questions they want to ask or the answers that they want to give. Always have a contingency plan. Rephrase the question. Break the question down. If it's a complex question, can you break it down into sections? Another one is providing an answer. So you can provide an indicative answer and then build on this. So always have a contingency for what you would do. So how can we encourage engagement? So this slide summarizes another piece of research, which is talking about positive and negative factors. So positive factors, this links to the silence point I made before. Allow time for questions and reflection. When you're asking questions within a session, build that in. Build in how long it takes to ask a question, how long you want people to think about the question before you actually start collecting answers. Encouraging questions, particularly from my experience, the most positive and encouraging teaching sessions I've ever had is where the students are firing questions at me and provoking that debate. So encourage questions. And again, positive factor is a use of particular methods for asking questions, links to what I said before. Sometimes verbal Q&A is very effective, or you might want to use something like Vevox, or you might want to use another way of asking and answering questions. So use of particular methods rather than the same thing all the time. This paper also suggested some maybe obvious but still need to be stated negative factors, time pressure. If you don't give people enough time to think about their questions and their answers, then you won't get quality responses. Another important point is, particularly if students are asking questions or anybody is asking questions, is if you're critical that the student is seeking help, that just creates barriers and people close up. So we should always welcome questions, even if they might seem obvious to us. And of course, intimidation. This comes back to the point about creating the right atmosphere. So again, these are all obvious points, but it is something that's very easy to do. And so linked to that previous one, in terms of strategies, building in time is obvious, encouraging questions, and in terms of creating the right atmosphere, demonstrating respect for their questions and creating opportunities to learn from each other. You can learn as much from your audience as your audience can learn from you. And the most important thing is that we want to promote effective help seeking. If people want help, we want to make sure that they feel comfortable to ask for help, and that might be through asking questions. And so this is a really useful article that was recently published, which you may want to have a look at. So most importantly, let's learn from my mistakes. Asking leading questions. So this first question is an example of a leading question. Do you think we should wait any longer? This is a leading question because you're already suggesting what the answer might be. Whereas you could ask it in this way. This is taking longer than planned. What should we do? You're still stating there's a problem, but you're asking a much more specific directed question. Again, these are just my personal reflections. So I welcome any debate or alternative views you might have. Asking questions that don't provide an answer. And I'll illustrate this with a good point. So with this question, do you know who the UK Prime Minister is? It doesn't really provide an answer because although people can say yes or no, there is no way of knowing whether they do really know the answer. And so we can ask the same question in a different way, who is the UK Prime Minister? And then of course you will get some type of answer. So just think about how you might phrase your questions. Asking limiting questions. Now the top on my title of my slide, I said approaches to avoid question mark. Well, of course, sometimes you might want a limiting question with a specific answer. But of course, you might not want to assume a certain answer. So that is something to bear in mind. I'm going to list these all at once, partly because these are all the ones I've used in the past, which have caused me to run into problems, essentially. This will be an easy one. By saying this before I ask the question, the students are already starting to think, I should find this easy. Why am I not finding it easy? And that puts them on edge. The second question is linked to this. Everyone knows this, and then I'll ask the question. The problem is if there are people in the room that don't know it, then you're in some way decreasing their confidence. So I would avoid those sort of starts to questions. The next one, why don't you have questions? Again, people might not have questions right now. That's not necessarily a negative, but you're creating a negative sense in their mind. My question has been met with silence. Again, that's just creating a bad atmosphere. And then you can see the following. No questions must mean everyone is fine. Again, it doesn't mean everyone's fine. They might still have questions they want to ask you privately. You should have questions. Well, if they don't have questions, then they don't have questions. And then the last one, do you understand? The problem I've found with that one is that everybody in the room nods and says, I do understand, but then it becomes quickly apparent that they don't understand. So just be careful with those. So I've got some examples of alternative questions. So rather than saying, do you have any questions now, which is the title of my talk today, I often say, what questions do you have? So rather than feeling on edge because they don't have any questions, it's just a more subtle way of asking anybody if they have questions. Version 1 is very, it puts people on edge. Does anyone disagree? Because everyone's thinking, should I agree? Should I disagree? Version 2 makes it okay for disagreement by saying some disagree. And so that allows for greater engagement. And just to finish really, one other way is when you're looking to obtain detail, for example, there's some really good examples from sport for this. So you might be asking someone, were you watching the ball when you hit that shot? The problem with that is that someone might realize they weren't watching the ball and it feels like there's an accusation there. Whereas in the second one, you could say to someone, was the ball spinning when you hit that shot? And if they say, I don't know, then that gives you a sense that they perhaps weren't watching the ball. So that's a really good example of where you can have an alternative phrase. And then in terms of seeking understanding, you could ask, does everyone understand? But instead, you could say, is there anything you would like me to explain more? And again, that just allows for a slightly different answer because you can look at understanding through there. And then other strategies is linking questions. Can you link one question to another? That's a really useful way to encourage discussion. And that also leads to follow-up questions. In your strategy, have a follow-up question. That can be a really good way to encourage discussion. And so in summary, that was quite a whistle-stop tour. But the most important thing is that there should be a strategy and your behavior will affect their behavior, and be careful with your phrasing. Okay, thank you. I'll pass you over to Amy now.
Thank you very much, Neil. I am just going to take back control and we'll have a look at some of the questions that we've had in. So hopefully you can see some of the questions there. Let's go through some of them. So yeah, there was some questions on whether the webinar will be available, but I think that's been answered. The answer is yes, it will be. And you know, some positive comments about the phrases to avoid, and I can definitely see myself having used some of them, even just in a workshop yesterday. But we got our first question there. So already, okay, that's about the sharing the webinar. So Neil, do you have any experience or views on whether students engage better using Vevox anonymously or not?
From my experience, yes, they engage better when it's anonymous. because it comes back to the purpose of what I've been talking about today, is that by anonymizing the responses, students feel more confident because they know if they are incorrect, it won't be obvious to anybody else. And also, if you're talking about a more contentious issue, it gives people a little bit more freedom to be more provocative if that is, relevant to what you're trying to discuss.
Yeah, lovely, thank you. And how many times did you ask the poor questions before you realised there was a better phrasing?
That's a really good question. Probably far too many times. So I can't put a number on it. There were two things that made me realise. One of which was having peer observation. So a colleague of mine observed, and they pointed out when I'd said things like, "This is an easy one." I was trying to be encouraging, but they pointed out, what if somebody didn't know the answer? And the second one was student feedback as well. And when a student came up to me quite worried and said, "I don't know the answer to that one. Should I know the answer?" So far too many times, but luckily other people pointed out to me and I acted on that.
Great. How would you change how you would ask questions depending on the group size? Okay.
Yeah, I sort of hinted at a little bit before and talked about small groups. So in a large group, then maybe not the question itself, but maybe the mechanism. So in a large group, a voting app like Vevox would make more sense. Whereas if there's just 4 people in the room, it may have less importance, but also the questions can often be more detailed, or if it's a small group, you're looking for perhaps more descriptive answers, so your question's a bit more open, whereas in a large group, they might be slightly more closed, because it's more difficult to have extensive debate with maybe 100 people in the room.
Okay. How do you balance using a tool like Vevox whilst not neglecting improving students' verbal communication?
Yeah. That's a really good point and something that I've thought a lot about. To give you an example, I might use something like Vevox to have the initial discussion where I get lots of responses from the audience, and then using those responses and showing them on the screen, I then would give the students an additional task where they have to expand on those points and agree and disagree with them, or maybe rank them. And then I would split them into groups and get them to do that with the people on their table, if you like. So then they are having a dialogue in person verbally with each other and with me about the responses from the earlier one. Because the key thing is the Vevox has allowed them to give lots of good answers, which we can then expand on. It's given them that initial confidence to start talking about it more.
Great. We got time for a couple more questions, so let me just check I haven't missed anything at the top before. Okay. So do you only use Vevox Q&A in large classes, or do you use in smaller seminar type classes? I mean, we sort of answered that.
I would say that I started with mostly large classes, but I do use it in smaller ones, particularly if I want to have a record of the questions and answers, because with something like Vevox, you can download the responses on an Excel file, for example, for the students to have a look at again, and also for me to have a look at again. So it can be very useful in small groups as well.
I feel like I saw something here. Yes, that sort of relates to what you just said. What value do you see in sharing data following Vevox sessions for student engagement?
Well, one of the things is that there are some students and audience members who may not follow the dialogue and discussion during the session as well as others. And so by able to be sharing the data, people can have a look at it again and they can see it. And then they can look at it and reflect again. So that's particularly useful in sharing data following Vevox sessions, because it can be that the learning carries on rather than it just being a static discussion there and then.
Yeah, I think I'll just take one more question. I just saw one come in that I quite liked. Early on, you mentioned students who don't prepare. Any thoughts on that?
Yes, it does happen. I think we have to be mindful that students have lots going on, particularly students now. They often have jobs and other responsibilities to do. So I tend to be fairly relaxed, but I always have a backup if students haven't prepared. So I have some pre-prepared questions or pre-prepared answers, which they can then expand on. So there's a number of ways that you can deal with that. Also, in terms of asking them to prepare, be conservative in terms of what you're asking them to do. So I'd rather give them a much smaller task and they do engage with that.
Cool. Okay, I think we'll leave the sort of Q&A there. And thank you very much, Neil. It was great to have you today. That sort of brings the webinar to an end. One thing that I would like to do just before you all leave us is just let you know that we do have another great webinar coming up. It's on the 19th of March. We have Dean Whitcomb from the University of South Wales joining us, and he'll be sharing a bit about how they've integrated Vevox into simulated activities to collect student feedback. So that should be another really great session. So yes, thank you very much again to all of you for joining the session today, and a massive thank you to Neil for sharing his presentation and research today. So thank you, Neil.
Thank you.
Thanks. Have a great day, everyone. Bye-bye.